glad you're watching this. If you missed our last meeting, I just wanted to briefly go through our last presentation, just so that you could not get left behind. So last time we covered a just kind of a warm-up for the cosmological argument, and this time we're actually going to get into the philosophical reasons why an actual infinity is impossible, and thereby showing that the universe could not be infinite and it would need some type of cause. And then from there, we would deduce what kind of properties the first cause would have to have. So before we get into that, I'm just going to quickly review what we did last time. So we went over inductive and deductive reasoning. And if you don't remember, inductive reasoning was something where the conclusion didn't necessarily follow from the first two premises. So, for example, I could say that in the case of the book of Acts, that in the cases where I have been able to test Luke for historical accuracy in the book of Acts, he has been found reliable. Therefore, he is probably reliable in the other cases I can't verify. That's an example of inductive reasoning. Or to use a even more simple example, the sun rises and sets every day that I've been alive and in my own experience, so I can probably conclude that it will rise and set tomorrow as well. Now, as you may have guessed, deductive reasoning is different in that in deductive reasoning, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. So that would be something like, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So in this type of argument, if I accept the first two premises, then I must also accept the conclusion. And this is formulated, if you look to your right, in if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. So these are just symbols for the propositions you would use in a deductive argument. And as we talked about last time, this argument form in particular is called modus ponens. And the Kalam cosmological argument is a form of modus ponens. Now, just so that you recognize this, that deductive arguments aren't only modus ponens. There's several different deductive forms. But just for the Kalam, we're going to just be familiar with the term modus ponens, because that's the only one that's pertinent to this argument. Now, if you don't remember, in order to refute the Kalam cosmological argument, you have to refute one of the first two premises, just like we covered in deductive arguments. So that means I would either have to refute that if the universe began to exist, then the universe had a cause. So I would refute that the universe needed a cause. Or I would have to refute the second one, that the universe began to exist. In other words, I would have to demonstrate that the universe is eternal. And then what the Kalam tries to demonstrate once we've established that the universe began to exist and needed a cause, as we can show that the first cause had certain properties, namely, the first cause had to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial. It also had to be sufficiently powerful to create the universe and everything in it, and as well as personal. And these are all attributes of God. Now, this doesn't get us to the God of Christianity. This just gets us to, perhaps a monotheistic God, a one God who created everything else. But from there, at least in classical apologetics, once we've set up reasons to believe in God, we can argue for things like the resurrection or the reliability of Scripture, and then get to Christianity. But the Kalam doesn't try to get to Christianity. We're just trying to give an argument just for the existence of God. Now, these are some terms you need to be familiar with before we actually get into the arguments, the philosophical arguments against an actual infinity. First one is potential infinity. Now, a potential infinity is probably very familiar to most of us. This is just a series of things or numbers that is approaching infinity, but it never arrives at infinity. It's um, always going closer and closer to infinity, but it never quite gets there. So, for example, you could think of a graph, and you have, a parabola where the line's always getting closer and closer to 0 point, but it's never getting there. That's what this would be. A potential infinity would be like. Now, an actual infinity is something that is already infinite in its parts. Um, so just to give a illustration of these two different concepts, an actual infinity would be something that is already, set. Like if I just take the number 20, for example, a potentially going towards 20 is different from actually being 20, right? So I can have something that is already 20, or I can have something that's headed towards 20. That's the difference between these two concepts. And then this third term is also really important. That's called an infinite regress. And this would just be a past infinite series of things. So if you think about the case of the universe, if the universe is eternal, that means it has a past infinity of causes, and that would be an infinite regress. So for any time you want to choose in the present or in the future, there will be an infinite amount of events prior to that, if the universe is eternal. Now, we're going to focus on defending the second premise of the Kalam in this presentation, which is just that the universe began to exist. We're not going to get into the scientific evidence this time. We're going to just be dealing with the philosophical reasons why the universe began to exist. And I will include arguing against an actual infinity. So the first example is called Hilbert's Hotel. We went over this last year, and so you're probably already familiar with it, and you've also seen it in the videos on Reasonable Faith on YouTube. So let's just imagine a hotel that has infinitely many rooms and infinitely many guests. So this hotel would have really odd properties, okay? The hotel would be able to accommodate as many guests as you would like, even though it's already full, right? It's already actually infinitely full of guests, but because we're dealing with infinity, we could add infinity and we would still have the same number of guests we had in the beginning. You could also take out everyone in an odd numbered room. So you could say, all right, I'll take out, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, all the way into infinity, right? All the odd numbered rooms the people will leave. And then I'm just left with the even numbered rooms. So how many guests are left in the hotel? Infinitely many. But infinitely many guests have just left the hotel, right? Because I took all the ones out from the odd numbered rooms. Now, this doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But you could make the problem even worse by saying, notice how in the other example of taking out people of all the odd numbered rooms, we've taken infinitely many out. Well, let's say that we took everyone out except the first 3 rooms. So you only have 3 guests left in the hotel. What have we done now? We've taken infinity minus infinity in both cases, but we've reached different results, right? We've taken the same amount, subtracted by the same amount, and reached different results. In the one case, we've had infinity guests left in the hotel after subtracting infinity. In the other case, we've had infinity guests leave and subtracted infinity, and we've been left with 3 guests, right? This doesn't make sense. This is a contradiction. So Hilbert's Hotel is just showing that you can't have an actual set of infinity. This doesn't make sense. And the important thing to take away from this is that we've just taken equal quantities and subtracted equal quantities, and we come up with different results. That's how we get the contradiction. And if you want to say that it is possible that there is an actual infinity of things in reality, then Hilbert's hotel should also be possible as well. And that's what this slide also says, that Hilbert's hotel, if an actual infinity is possible, then Hilbert's hotel should be possible. But this violates all our intuitions about what's possible in the real world. It just doesn't seem like something like Hilbert's hotel could actually exist. So here's some objections to Hilbert's hotel. So we see infinity in mathematics, particularly in set theory, and they don't necessarily result in contradictions. Well, the issue with this is that, first of all, we don't, it's heavily debated whether mathematics actually corresponds to the real world. Set theory has certain, axioms and ways of having a set of infinity that is actually infinite. But why think this will make sense in the concrete world? Math is actually, in my opinion, it's abstract. To illustrate this, think about a proposition like -2. Well, you can't have -2 things or -2 people in reality. That doesn't make any sense. That exists in the abstract in mathematics, which is kind of giving us a reason to think that, okay, maybe mathematics doesn't really correspond to what we would see in reality. And so Hilbert's hotel, while it may be possible mathematically, it wouldn't be possible in the real world. Now, another objection that you'll hear is that the absurdities that we see in Hilbert's hotel, they only result because human beings just don't understand the nature of infinity. Well, this isn't actually the case. Infinity is widely used, as we just mentioned in set theory, and it is understood well enough that we can actually recognize the absurdities in Hilbert's hotel. It's because we do understand infinity that we can clearly point out the problems with an example like Hilbert's hotel. Now, the second argument against an actual infinity is the one by counting up to infinity by successive addition. Just saying that you could count from, starting with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up until you reached infinity. So the argument's just trying to show that this is impossible. Now, when you're putting forth this argument, it's important to recognize that it doesn't actually deny that an actual infinity of things can exist. It only is showing that a collection containing an actual infinite number of things cannot be formed by adding one member after another. So here is the formal argument that Dr. Craig sets out with, and it's this. The series of events in time is a collection formed by adding one member after another. 2, a collection formed by adding one member after another cannot be actually infinite. In conclusion, the series of events in time cannot be actually infinite. So let's look at each of these in turn. The first premise here, the series of events in time is a collection formed by adding one member after another. It's not really that widely disputed, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time defending it. What we're mainly going to go after is premise 2, that a collection formed by adding one member after another cannot be actually infinite, because this is the more disputed premise among the two premises in this argument. So, once again, our second premise, a collection formed by adding one member after another cannot be actually infinite. So let's think about this for a sec. Let's imagine someone that's counting from the past. Okay, you have a backwards counter who's going from infinity, and they are counting down -3, -2, -1, 0, and they've stopped. Well, why did they finish now instead of 100 years in the past or 50 years in the future? there's no explanation that can be given here, because no matter what time they stopped counting, you still have an infinity in the past. And remember, since infinity is the same number, no matter, you know, how much would be added to it, that no matter how far you go into the future, it's still the same amount of time that this person has counted in the past, right? It's still infinity. And that's the problem here. If you could form an infinite by successive addition, there's no explanation or reason why this backwards counter would finish tomorrow versus any other time. You just can't give one. That's just the nature of infinity. Now, one clarification about this whole idea of the backwards counter and the formation of infinity from successive addition is that it relies on a theory of time known as A theory. And A theory just says that the present is real, but the past and future are not equally real, meaning that they don't currently exist. That's all that it means to say that they're not all equally real. So some people will argue against this theory of A theory, which is also called presentism. But this is the common view of time. And honestly, you don't need to worry about this too much. I just want to explain it for those of you who may be going into deeper reading on this topic, because there are alternative theories of time. And if you're really interested in this, I would recommend Dr. Craig's book, Time and Eternity. He's one of the foremost scholars on time. So it's well worth the read, although it's quite complicated. But anyways, most people accept that, yeah, sure, the past doesn't exist now, the future doesn't exist now, we're in the present, right? So you don't have to worry about this in, you know, just evangelizing to lay people, or even, you know, people who do have a high understanding in other fields. They'll probably accept this theory of time as well. Now, here's another illustration just to kind of press the point against actual infinite, an actual infinity of things. So if we had an actual infinite number of days, we would also have an infinite number of weeks or months. So in other words, although a week is longer than a day and a month is longer than a week, if they're infinite, we have an infinite collection and whatever amount of time you want to choose. Now, in our last meeting, some people objected that I was just using, you know, weeks and days, which are just arbitrary lengths of time that we've come up with. It doesn't matter. Whatever measure of time you want to use, whether, you know, that would be 1,000 years, you know, versus 10 weeks or whatever you want to use. It doesn't have to be days, weeks, or months. The measures would be the same because they would all be infinite. And that's the problem here. This seems to totally violate our intuitions. They would all add up to infinity, even though they're different lengths. That seems to not really make a whole lot of sense. Now, there are other problems or other paradoxes that have been brought up about infinity, and we won't get into all of those. These are just to sort of illustrate just how absurd and ridiculous an actual infinity would be in reality. So yeah, I'll move on. Now, these are some study questions that I mentioned last time, and you can think about them for yourselves. First one is, can you think of any possible way an actual infinity can exist in reality? The only way I can think of to defend this question, although think about it for yourselves, is to say that infinity is just, the nature of it would be different than a finite set of things. And so things like Hilbert's hotel or the other paradoxes we brought up would be possible in infinity, and that's just sort of the nature of how it would work. Although we can see that doesn't really answer why it's so absurd or anything like that. It's sort of just kind of accepting the absurdity and saying that's just how it would be if infinity were possible. Now, the second question here is, how could one defend that the universe began to exist in a simple and quick way to someone with no prior knowledge of the Kalam cosmological argument? One way I would present or talk to someone is I would just ask them something like, what do you think about the universe? Do you think it's always existed, or did it begin to exist? And let's say they said, well, I think that it has always existed. Well, I could say, okay, so you're saying that it stretches infinitely back into the past, right? And they would agree with that if they're saying that the universe has always existed. And I'd say, okay, so you're saying that today it's been infinitely, an infinite amount of time between the universe, the beginning of this universe, and now. And that would be the same for tomorrow, or 100 years from now, or a million years in the past. No matter which you choose, it's going to be infinitely long. Does that seem right to you? You can just ask them a simple question like that and see what they say. Probably a lot of them would say, no, that doesn't seem right. If they continue, yeah, I think that's fine. You can use examples like Hilbert's Hotel, or the example I used about days, weeks, and months. There's all sorts of different ways you can talk about these infinities and the issues that they bring about. Now, the next question, if you were an atheist, how would you go about denying that the universe began to exist? How could you show that the universe is eternal? Well, this is also sort of part of the first question, is you can just say, well, the nature of infinity is just different than finite sets. So we wouldn't expect it to be as easily understandable, or we would expect that, yeah, there would be absurdities if you do have an actual infinity. You can also opt for something like a multiverse theory with an infinite number of universes. Some people do that. One issue I'd like to point out about that is that if you do have an infinite number of universes, then you're going to have universes that are logically contradictory. So you'll have one universe that's infinitely big and one that's infinitesimally small. Well, these couldn't coexist, right? Because if these universes are occupying space, how can one be infinitely big and there be room left over for other universes? That could be one good objection for a universe, for infinitely many universes or things like that, that they would result in logical contradictions and not accept them. But in any case, if someone wants to put a theory like that forth, where they mention a multiverse, don't worry about that. That's fine, because all of those can be objected to with the paradoxes against infinity that we've already mentioned. Now, this last question is really interesting. So, are God's thoughts actually infinite? Does he have an actual infinity of thoughts going on? This is a little bit tougher objection to answer. Some ways you could go about sort of not giving an answer to this, but just not dealing with it altogether, is from the beginning, you could say that you could argue just against an infinity of causes rather than an infinite set, and then that would allow God to have an actually infinite number of thoughts. Others, like Dr. Craig, would say that God's thoughts are not differentiated. So God just knows truth as sort of one whole, thing of truth, and there's no separation of parts within this truth. He just knows it all immediately and understands it all. So that's one option. I'll leave you to think about that. It's a really interesting thought and objection that I've encountered. So now we're going to shift over to tactics. If you do have any questions about the kalam and what I presented here, then please just message me and ask. And actually, I'll be trying to send out a free PDF, both of tactics and reasonable faith, of the chapters dealing with this argument, so you can have a look at those. Now we'll shift over to tactics, and this is just dealing with the burden of proof. And Greg Kukul calls us reversing the burden of proof. So for those of you who don't know, the burden of proof it's just debate etiquette. It means that whoever makes the claim has a burden to give evidence for their claim and give an argument for their claim. So this would go for someone who asserted that God existed or God does not exist. It doesn't matter. Whoever makes the claim has the burden of proof to give evidence for that claim. Now, one thing you'll encounter every now and then is someone will say, well, negative claims can't be proven, so I don't have any burden of proof. So someone who says God does not exist will say, well, you can't prove a negative. Well, this is just false. And I want you to think about this carefully in case you do encounter this objection, because it's a commonly repeated idea, but it clearly doesn't work. For example, let's think of other things that we can know do not exist. So, for example, married bachelors don't exist, right? Because a bachelor means to be unmarried. So a bachelor couldn't be married. That's something that does not exist. We can show that no leprechauns or unicorns exist. We can show basically anything that's logically contradictory, such as square circles don't exist. And so this claim that you can't prove a negative is just false. There's lots of examples of things that we can show do not exist. Now, Greg Kukul talks about this, and this is really important when you're having a discussion with someone in evangelism, is notice the difference between when they're telling you a story or giving you a narrative versus actually giving you an argument. Those are different things. An argument has evidence behind it. Telling a story is just creating, something out of nothing, right? It doesn't necessarily have any good reasoning or data behind it at all. So here's an example. Let's say that we're discussing with someone the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which, by the way, if you don't know, most scholars would say goes back to around 5 or 6 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, so extremely early, before 40 AD. That's what we're looking at. So let's say you're discussing this early creed and Paul's claim that Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. Someone could say, and I'm sure you'll hear this if you bring this up, well, clearly Paul made this claim up because he wanted to persuade the Corinthians to believe in the resurrection. Well, what's the first thing you should say here? What's the temptation to react to this claim? And so the temptation is to say, that's not true, and here's the evidence or reasons why. That is what you should avoid, okay? When somebody says something like Paul made it up, you should ask them, okay, well, what is your evidence that Paul has made up that claim? Or, as we'll see in a second, the generic form of the question, how did you come to that conclusion? You don't need to argue against what this person claims right at the outset. Because think about this, they can come up with as many stories as they like. And if you keep trying to refute them, they can still keep coming up with stories. However, notice they've made a claim and you can ask them, okay, well, give me some evidence for that. Show me why I should accept your claim and show me why that fits the data better than what I've already been trying to demonstrate. That's what you should do, because anyone who makes a claim has a burden of proof, not only the theist. If I want to say Paul has made up the claim, then I need to show why that should be the case. Now, three things you need to ask yourself when someone is giving you a story, or even when they're giving you an argument. Is this possible? So Greg Koukl gives the example of someone claiming that the Bible was made up by Constantine in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea, and it's all just made up, is way after Jesus lived that the Bible was written, and so on and so forth. Well, is this possible? No, it's not possible, because we have many, many manuscripts that have come long before the 4th century of the New Testament that are widely distributed in different regions and areas. We even have different text types like the Alexandrian, the Western. And so the idea that Constantine somehow was able to destroy all these manuscripts that already were in existence and textual traditions and create a new Bible that's totally corrupted and far removed from Jesus, just that wouldn't make sense. Well, let's think about, is this view plausible? Let's take the same example. Well, obviously it's not plausible, because it wouldn't make any sense how Constantine could have made that type of thing happen. Now, the last question is really important. Is this theory that this person's putting up, is it probable? In other words, does this explanation account for the data or evidence better than competing ones? A good example of this was, say I was talking to an atheist who agreed with me that objective moral values and duties do exist. I could say that theism, or the belief that God exists, better accounts for objective moral values and duties than atheism does. That would be an example of abductive reasoning. And so when someone gives you an argument, just think about that. Okay, does their argument fit the data better than the argument I've been offering? Okay, and if it does, then maybe we should reconsider our argument. And if it doesn't, then you could point that out, that your argument fits the data more easily and simpler than theirs. So we've got two Columbo questions now. The first one that we covered last week was, what do you mean by that? And this is sort of a clarifier question, just to try and understand the other person's view. And I believe last time I talked about being a student of the other person's view. We need to try and understand their viewpoint as well as we can. Because otherwise, when you bring up objections, you're not going to get anywhere, because you're not really touching on what they think. You're sort of arguing against your own idea and preconceived notion of what their argument is. We need to avoid that. That's why this first question is really important. And then the second one that we covered today was, how did you come to that conclusion? And these questions are not, you don't have to ask them in this form every time. You're welcome to, but you can ask them in all sorts of ways. If someone says, well, I don't believe in God, you could say, well, what do you think God is like? Or what do you mean when you talk about God? Or instead of saying, how'd you come to that conclusion? Like in the example I gave, you can say, okay, well, what evidence do you have to support that claim? Or why think that's true? And if someone says, and I love this, Greg Koukl brings this up in his book. If someone says, well, I don't really have any reasons, then you could say, why do you believe something that you don't have any good reasons to think is true? That's a great question to ask. And don't be surprised when you ask someone to give you a reason for what the claim they've made. They won't have any, because most people are just giving you slogans they've heard. They're arguing slogans rather than having a carefully formed argument. All right. And that's what we're doing in this group, is we're trying to figure out carefully formed and thoughtful arguments and reasons that Christianity is true, right? God does not appreciate bad arguments for his existence or bad arguments for the resurrection. God wants us to find the best arguments. God wants us to not be afraid to look up objections, the best objections we can find, and refute them, right? So that concludes this presentation. If you have any questions on any of this, then please feel free to ask me, send me a message, and I'll see you next time.